Last-minute shakeup at 5:30 a.m., laundry situation not good. And when your focus is on helping your clients, it's easy to forget about yourself. But NASM knows trainers.
Morning, Ryan. It's okay.
And staying in front of the day isn't always as simple
Ryan.
as 1, 2, 3. So when the unexpected has you pressing pause,
What's the latest on creatine?
I'm going to get back to you on that.
let NASM1 help you press play. Visit NASM.org to sign up for a membership today.
You're listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast with Derek Brown on the NASM Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Mindful Drinking Podcast, where we talk about tips and information that you can use to drink more mindfully. My name is Derek Brown. I'm your host. I'm an NASM certified wellness coach, an award-winning bartender, and author of Mindful Mixology, a comprehensive guide to no and low alcohol cocktails. And as a bartender, I know that there's two topics that you're just not supposed to broach with customers, and that is politics and religion. But that seems incredibly limiting to me, especially since, for me, spirituality is extremely important, and it's one of my greatest character strengths and a constant source of inspiration to me. But I also see how it has a particular resonance with alcohol consumption, in that spirituality is one of the most important protective factors for prevention and recovery from alcohol use disorder. So I'm going to bring it up. I'm going to talk about it today. And while we might believe different things, increasingly Americans are identifying as nuns. So just to clarify, a nun is somebody who on the survey, when they're talking about, are you spiritual? They say yes. When it comes to what your religion is, they say none of the above. And that's becoming an increasingly growing category in the United States. And so in a way, it's somewhat anachronistic to practice organized religion. However, it is religious organizations that are investing in training around investing in spiritual training and spiritual topics. And one of the main reasons why we still look towards religious leaders, even when we ourselves are not particularly practicing a religion. For myself, I've identified as a Catholic, but if forced at gunpoint to admit my religious beliefs, I might have to back off a little bit and claim something called cultural Catholicism. I don't necessarily believe everything within the catechism. For those who don't know, catechism is our rule book. And that's just real. And so, like most Americans, I define spirituality pretty broadly. And for me, it's not about a specific religion, but the practice of seeing ourselves connected to something greater. And that way, I don't find anything incompatible about not having a specific or any belief in God and being spiritual. So whether you're an animist or an atheist, rest assured, I have no intention of changing or challenging your beliefs. However, I thought I would invite a religious leader with experience with mindful drinking to discuss some of the benefits of spirituality and her particular experience. Therefore, I would love to welcome to the podcast Reverend Erin Jean Warde, who's the author of Sober Spirituality, The Joy of a Mindful Relationship with Alcohol, Episcopal priest of 12 years, and a spiritual director, and a recovery coach, and a lot of other things, but I'll let her tell you all the rest. So welcome to the show, Reverend Warde. I appreciate you being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. And y'all couldn't see me, but there was a lot of nodding going on when you were talking about your own thoughts on spirituality, because while I am an Episcopal priest and love that expression of my faith, I think one of the gifts of my ministry has been having a lot of friends who actually are not spiritual or are not church going, or who maybe even identify as agnostic or atheist, who say, but you're my priest. And in a really like fun and loving way of saying, I don't know how I feel about X, Y, and Z, but they love having, a spiritual person in their corner when the stuff of life is really hard. And so I think that only speaks to what you're saying about having anchors, if only that, right? Some sort of spiritual home and foundation, if it's a friend, a community, a person that can support us when that is where we might end up reaching.
Absolutely. Wow. Well put. So I'm going to start right at the beginning of your own faith journey. And I know that we're going to get into more about your relationship with alcohol and mindful drinking, but I want to start with just because I'm very curious how you found your particular calling as a priest.
Absolutely. Great question. I have a background in being fundamentalist.
Mhm.
So when I was in high school in Alabama,
Mhm.
context matters, right? When I was in Alabama, all of my friends went to a fundamentalist church. And so I ended up attending that church and got really, really, really involved. And
Okay.
at a very, very young age, was able to say that I felt called to ministry.
Wow.
And the challenge with that was that I was in a denomination that didn't believe that women could be pastors and could be priests. And so I was told no, that that was not an opportunity for me, not even something I should pursue. And so I went off to college and studied English and creative writing and was intending to go down the path of being a professor because I loved teaching and I loved
Mhm.
being with people. But while I was in college, I always say that I deconstructed before it was cool. Like before I had that language for it, I fully deconstructed in college and ended up finding the Episcopal Church. And one of the really beautiful stories about that time in my life is that my priest, who happened to be a man, said to me one day in a very poignant and pointed way, "You know, we ordain women, right?"
Huh.
And I was like 21, I was like, cool, that's interesting. Like I don't want to talk about this. Fine. Very exciting for other women. And yet that question gnawed at me, right? It continued to burrow into me until I finally was in a context where I looked around the room and there were all of these women in collars.
Wow.
And it was an incarnation of a yes to what I had been told was no.
Right.
And so that was a big moment for me. And it really made me reckon with the fact that that calling I had when I was 15 was still present in me. And so I graduated from undergrad and I went directly into seminary and was ordained a deacon at the age of 24 and a priest at the age of 25.
Wow.
Which is the youngest you can canonically, like within the rules of our church, it's the youngest you can possibly be to be ordained. And yeah, that was like my conversion into ministry as a vocation in this specific way.
Wow. That's a great story. And definitely as somebody who grew up Catholic, I can understand that there's a lot of rules against who can and can't be a priest, and I appreciate that you found your path within the Episcopal tradition. So, uh, so I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad that you went on that path because I know that it also led you to write this book, which is a sober spirituality, the joy of a mindful relationship with alcohol. If you all haven't read this yet, this is such a great book, and exactly why I wanted you on today. And so I think that we got your faith story, which is fantastic. Let's hear a little bit about how alcohol entered the picture, because as a Catholic, we drink a lot, and I don't think it's all that different than the Episcopal Church, but maybe you can explain.
Yeah, I think you likely have a very interior knowledge about the fact that there can be alcohol use in churches. And something that has been really interesting as my work has reached this fruition is there are plenty of people who don't know that there are churches where there can be heavy drinking. Especially if you come from a fundamentalist background where you're taught alcohol's bad, don't ever do it. You think, wait, there are churches that drink, and there are church contexts where alcohol is something that is a part of social events and other parts of the church life. And as I said in my sort of coming to faith story in the Episcopal Church, I was turning 21 and becoming Episcopalian at the same time.
Mhm.
And I originally really kind of feared alcohol. It's a part of my family history that I was just thought, that's not really for me. And then as I got older, I, turned 21 and I saw other people who were, drinking, but not overdoing it. And so I decided that I would drink, but I waited until I was 21 to drink alcohol.
Okay.
And some of that was in church settings. Some of that was also just with friends. And it's interesting, I think when we look at sobriety stories, I've read plenty of Quit Lit, and there's this sort of often a rock bottom experience that typifies the conversion into sobriety. And for me, it really felt like a slow creep.
Okay.
Like starting out as a social drinker, but not really feeling like I overdid it that much. But then as stress compounded in my life, as the pressures of life grew, deciding to become a person who maybe has a drink at home alone at night, right? I used to say, oh, never drink alone, right? That's just a social thing. But then maybe I'll have just a drink or two at night. And feeling like it over time became something that I was not happy with.
Okay.
But also kind of feeling like, okay, but I also don't drink that differently from anyone around me, right? I'm on par with most of the people around me. And so it must not really be that big of a deal. And if there's no huge life crisis happening, eat, drink, and be merry, right? But over time, it was a very interior challenge. I started to feel, actually, I had two things that I thought were separate.
Okay.
One of those things was that I was not very happy. The other very separate thing was that I didn't love how I drank. And one day I sat down and I was really focused on why am I not happy? And I made a list of all of the things that I wanted out of my life. Big goals, right? Vision board type stuff. Write a book, love my body, feel joy. So I wrote out the whole list, and then I pulled back and I looked at it. And in the way that the Holy Spirit speaks to me, I could feel the Holy Spirit say into my life, this is possible for you on the other side of sobriety.
Wow.
And that was an awakening for me, because suddenly I had this awareness that these two disparate challenges were the same.
Wow.
That alcohol was a barrier to the joy that I really sought in my life. And a really, really fun tidbit about that is that everything on my list has happened for me.
That's great.
Really, like I wrote the book, like I did things that I wanted for myself. And that does not mean my life is perfect. Talk to anyone in sobriety and they will tell you that, life doesn't become perfect when you get sober. But it was a big moment for me. But a really, really interesting part about that is in that moment, I did not immediately quit drinking.
Okay.
Because desiring to quit drinking and actually being able to get together the tools, the support, and the ability to do that are two very different things.
Yep.
And so for, what was it, maybe like a year and a half to 2 years after that moment, I just started trying, and I would try and I would try and I would try. And I would do the thing where you wake up with a hangover and you're like, I'm never going to drink again.
I've done that many times myself. And
then your friend texts you at 4:30 and is like, want to grab a drink? And you're like, yeah, I'll be there in 20 minutes. Because I always joke that morning Erin and 5 o'clock Erin have never met. They're just very different people. But I would try, and I would get 2 days, I would get 3 days, and I would keep trying again, sometimes at varying amounts of time in between, but I just kept trying. And what I realized in retrospect is that there was a big fear I had. And the fear was that I felt like I had two choices. The two choices were, one, quit cold turkey, never drink again. You'll probably lose all your friends, you'll lose all your community, etc. Or keep drinking exactly the way you are drinking right now, period. Yeah. And dang it, if we don't choose the devil, we know, right? I guess I'll just keep drinking because that fear felt so hard. And what I realized is what I really wanted in my life is a middle way. And I think what the work you do and the work that I do is trying to create that middle way, that way of saying something that I said to myself, which is, why am I waiting on rock bottom?
Right.
I can start now and maybe do preventative care and maybe not end up in a place that is so challenging and so dire for me. And so what I've sought to do as bringing together my priesthood and my work as a recovery coach is to offer to people that sacred ground of the middle space to
Yeah.
say, you don't have to know yet. You don't have to come in with huge declarations of I'm never going to drink alcohol again. Wherever you are, let's start.
That's amazing. Okay, pause right there for 1 second. You're listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast, and I'm talking to Reverend Erin Jean Warde about mindful drinking and spirituality. And Reverend Warde was just recounting her story with how she changed her relationship to alcohol. And one of the things I noticed in your faith story and in this is something that I think is true about religions. In general, is they tend to fall on either side, right? You do it or you don't do it. You drink or you don't drink. And so, within certain religions, it's welcome. It's a part of the everyday celebrations. It's even part of the mass or part of the Seder. In other religions, it's strictly prohibited. It's, pushed away. And what you're saying, I think I really relate to, and I think that the people who are listening to this relate to too, is that there is a sacred middle way. And I love the way you put that sacred middle ground. And so I want to touch a little bit more on that and let you speak on this sacred middle ground.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times when we're working on anything like this, a relationship with alcohol, I would say anything wellness related, we can be very all or nothing, right?
Yep.
So, if I have a goal and I fall a little bit short of that, screw it. Let's just have an off day, right? As opposed to, what I do with my clients, let's start there. If I have a client that shows up and says, my plan on Tuesday was to not drink and I drank.
Right.
What I do is I say, what happened? Tell me about your day. How did you wake up? What was your day like? Let's figure out what happened, because then we can figure out what your trigger is. And then we can actually know, based on what your trigger was, how to build up some supports around that trigger so that when that trigger hits you again, you're equipped to try to respond to it differently. The reason that is powerful to me is because we're not actually just like resetting. We're not saying, forget about that day, it's over, a new day is today. We're saying even what we might consider personally as a slip up, or, I would not use this language, but failure is an opportunity for us to gather wisdom and learn from that in a way that's going to help you move forward toward what you hope for yourself.
Yeah.
And that to me is like the opposite of black and white thinking, because it's saying we're going to honor the reality of what is, and we're going to learn from it and move forward toward what we hope for.
That's amazing, because I had this, permit me for a little bit of a detour here. So my son is 10 years old. He plays baseball. He's very good at it. And he enjoys it a lot. Like most kids, he enjoys when he wins, and he enjoys much less so when he loses. Right. And so, one of the things that I try to get through to him, we talk about a lot, is the idea that it's data. That it's information, that losing actually is if you reframe it as this is a path, that whether it was like, oh, we saw that this happened, like you missed the ball when you didn't put your glove in the dirt, or you swung out when you moved your body in this way. These are the little adjustments you can make next time to improve the, catching the ball, hitting the ball, and potentially winning. But the winning part is also information. The losing part is also information. If you can put it in that context, then it feels less like like the end of the world, because I know how he feels, because I could be competitive myself at times, but I know he feels. And I think it feels like that sometimes to people when they're drinking. They feel like, all right, that's it. I drank, I lost, it's over, back to drinking. But in reality, what you're saying and what I was trying to communicate to my son about baseball is it's just information. Use it. Right.
Well, and on that note, working with people who will tell me their history, because we always start with history, right? Like, tell me about your history with alcohol. But, I'll work with people and they'll have a slip up and they'll say, I had a slip up. I had like one drink. And I'm like, okay, well, what happened? Well, then they tell me like this horribly triggering thing that any human being alive would be highly triggered by. And then I get to say to them, you had one of the most intensely triggering experiences a person could ever have, and you had one drink. A month ago, that would have been a bottle.
Yeah.
Let's notice how big of a deal your growth is. Are we still going to work on like that one drink, especially if it's a person who's seeking complete sobriety? Yeah, we're still going to dig into what happened.
Right.
But I'm also going to make sure, this is part of the like sacred middle ground. We're also going to make sure that even in what we perceive as failures, we're able to see growth. We're able to look back at where we started and see, look how far we've gotten comparatively. And often when I do that, they have never thought that, right? Like they're like, oh man, all I could see was that I failed. And now it's like, okay, I can see how much progress I've made versus if this thing had happened in my life a month ago.
This is where sometimes I see this, this different kind of reality between what people think religion is, and especially scripture, and what it really is, right? Like they think religion is this perfection, that you have to always live up to these ideals, when the scripture, and I'm going to talk about the Bible, but honestly, I'm sure it applies to many other scriptures, sacred scriptures as well, is that it's full of people who just make a whole lot of mistakes, right? Like, I mean, reading the Old Testament, like, good Lord, is just a lot of mistakes that happen, even in the New Testament, whatever. And again, I'm sure with other scriptures, nobody's perfect in it, are there? I mean, there was one person apparently that, in the Christian tradition that's perfect. Other than that, can you think of anybody who did it perfectly?
Well, and the other thing about it is so much of what I perceive in scripture, and I try to talk about this in the book as far as my interpretations of scripture in relationship with sobriety and the challenges and joys of that, is mercy. I mean, Jesus shows up with profound mercy to people. Yeah. Jesus often heals people who say, oh, no, don't heal me. I'm not worthy of that. And Jesus says, what if I told you you were? Right. And so when we think about especially the stigmatization of people who struggle with alcohol, it's like if that was presented in front of Jesus, I think that it would be very similar to the scriptures in which people don't feel worthy of it. And Jesus says, what if I told you that by virtue of breathing, you were worthy of healing and wholeness and wellness in mind, body, and soul?
I love that. And I'm sure that there's a lot of people out there that's a really welcome message, because I think a lot of us, even though we pretend that we're fine, we're doing well, we're whole inside, we're crumbling, we feel like we're not worthy. We feel like we can't overcome it, and we can. But one thing that you mentioned in the book, which I really love and I want to touch on, is that you say that there's no perfect way to heal. And I just think that's such a great message. I wonder if you can expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that, it feels ironic, but it's so real that perfectionism has become such an insidious part of our culture, our self-talk. And we can certainly, I think in recovery communities, hold ourselves to a really intense level of perfectionism. This goes back to like what I said about working with clients, that they think, oh, well, I had one drink, so I failed. And I'm trying to help them see the growth that they experience. But I think, it's very easy, even in recovery communities, for people to sometimes be judgmental of the ways that other people recover. To look at certain programs as being, the only way to get to a healthy place with alcohol. I think that what that does is it actually sets us up for that binary, right? Of, well, I'm doing recovery right, and you need to like get on my level, as opposed to, why am I not happy for you, right? Like, however it is that you can get to your healing and wholeness, the response I'm going to have to that is deep gratitude that you are experiencing healing and wholeness, because my hope for all people is that we reach healing and wholeness, right? Yeah. I actually think a lot of hatred, violence, like all the things we see in our world would diminish if we could all find our healing and our wholeness. So I genuinely hope that for all people. And the idea that I'm going to nitpick at the way that you do that is so demotivational, right? It's going to pull people out of their ability to get into their own healing rhythms. And so what I try to do is just see, certainly there's things I learn from other people, and I'm like, oh, I've never tried that. I think I want to try that in my own healing tools. but to, to use a term that I think is relevant in this conversation, to not be dogmatic about this approach. I think, what we were talking about earlier, sometimes even as an Episcopal priest, as someone who's like very steep in the churchy part of it, to pull back and say, oh yeah, but sometimes the church and Jesus are not on the same page. And so like having to acknowledge that and say, yeah, we're being dogmatic when what we need to do is actually really look at the scriptural witness of how Jesus Christ acted in the world today. Because if we did, we'd know the response is mercy and grace, right?
Yeah. I've sometimes heard that is separating Christ from the corporation. So I think that can sometimes be a useful thing, but the community part of it is a really critical part of it too. And so I think that like, even though I do see that people are fleeing religion, right? The nuns, I do, and just in case somebody just tuned in, nuns, Nones, the people who are none of the above religions, not the women with the habit. That's something different. But, community is so critical to this whole equation. And, being a Christian or being Jewish or being, Muslim, Hindu, any of these religions always require some aspect of the community, which I think is a really crucial part of it. And mindful drinking too. I mean, we rely on other people, whether we're setting goals that we want with other people, whether we're just asking somebody to help and support us. I think that can be really, really great. And when we come together, whether it's through religious practices or whether it's through spiritual practices we identify in our own life, I think that can be really incredible.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I enjoy talking about is the fact that we've really made sure that challenges of substances are a personal problem, that you personally struggle and you personally need to work on that. So if you could just work on that, that would be great, right? As opposed to acknowledging the societal problem that we have around substances. The fact that 3.3 million people, I think maybe it's 3 million now. It was 3.3 when I wrote the book.
Fair.
But, at least 3 million people per year die due to alcohol. That's not a personal problem. 3 million people aren't dying because of a personal problem. We have a societal problem. And so really, when you talk about community, it is certainly the actual, incarnate community of the people that you talk to. But it's also destigmatizing in the broader sense and saying, hey, you know what? One of the things that we know for sure is there's no such thing as a community in the world that is untouched by addiction, period. No such thing. So whatever community you're in, acknowledging that there is some wound in the room, how can I be compassionate to that wound? Because that, I think, is what's going to help us both on the personal level and on the broader societal level, begin to chip away at that pervasive feeling of isolation, because that isolation only exacerbates our maladaptive coping mechanisms because we're stuck in shame and we're not reaching out for support.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great way to put it. And I just think of those wounds as, just the process of being human. I mean, we just encounter so many things in our lives. I know some of you out there are going through a hard time. And some of you are on the other side of that hard time. But I love this line that you said, that the path to divinity is through humanity. And so maybe experiencing those very human moments and admitting to them can be a really great way that we can reclaim divinity and that we can connect to the divine. So I wonder if you could speak on that.
Yeah, that's a theology 101 throwback, because my professor, loved Athanasius, who says God became human so that humans can become God. Wow. Which is one of the church father quotes that I love. And, something that has really been powerful for me, and if you read the book, I think it comes through in the book, is that as a Christian, which I can only speak for what I believe, we do believe that God became human. And so often when I pray with people or pray for myself, I pray in gratitude that, we believe that God became human, so that in our human struggles, when we take them to God, we know that God can understand them because God has felt humanity.
Right.
And that is such a balm to me. I think, it's hard to sometimes lose this idea of like what people call the like sky daddy God, like just this very out of, ethereal belief. And for me to instead see this Jesus in scripture that was mixing together spit and dirt and these grimy human realities, going into tombs that stunk with death, to be present in that. What that means is that when my life feels like that tomb, or my life feels like all I can pull together is spit and mud, all of those things are opportunities for healing. And that's a real comfort for me, because I can only be human. And so why wouldn't we just acknowledge the reality of life rather than pretending we get to live above and outside of it?
Yeah. Wow. Wonderful information there. Wonderful way to put it. And I think that, that humanness to divinity, maybe that's part of the Christian tradition, but I do know that there are other traditions that, talk about similar aspects of that. So I guess I'd like to step back just a second and say, all right, let's say that somebody's listening to this. They're not Christian. They don't plan to be. We're not here proselytizing or expecting people to sign up. If that's what you like, if you connect to this, wonderful. God's got you. I often think I don't need to preach to anybody. We got the best preacher in the world, right? God himself or themselves.
Yeah.
But I think that, but let's say that somebody's experiencing this moment where they're like, how do I connect to something spiritual? I don't necessarily want to go to church. How would you advise somebody in that path?
It's a fantastic question. Actually, I have a few spiritual directees who are, interestingly, like pretty profoundly non-religious, but they still want like a companion and a guide and someone to love and support them through the journey. And so I think what I would really encourage a person to do is, as you have said, to find community, because sometimes that loneliness, I like to joke with myself that like sometimes my inner voice can be trusted and sometimes it can't. And the circumstances really define that, right? I think it was Anne Lamott that said, my mind is a neighborhood I don't want to go into alone. And so I think having an external processor that you can talk to is really huge, just so that if you're starting to feel like you're really in that spiraling, stewing mental place, you have some people to help get you out of that a little bit and get you back into, for example, reminders of your worthiness, reminders of your belovedness, reminders that you are loved as you are, right? Which none of those things are explicitly Christian. That's just what I believe about humanity and divinity. I would also say meditation can be a really powerful tool for this, that personally I consider meditation prayer because I offer that time to God. But plenty of people don't understand meditation as being explicitly religious or tied to any sort of like dogma or belief in God. And we know there are so many psychological tools, psychological ways that this can be a positive tool for people.
Yeah.
Also getting into your body. When I talk about the incarnation and it being such a powerful thing for me, it also is part of the fact that, when I was getting sober, I just started awakening to my body. It was like, oh, I don't feel numb anymore the way I felt numb for so many years. And so being able to get into your body in whatever ways feel good for you is just a reminder of that awakening that I think for me seems to transcend religion.
Yeah. And I know that you had mentioned in the book that, if we go through this process, and in the book, a lot of what you talk about is recovery, but you also do talk about mindful drinking and that middle way. And, you talk about when you go through this process, which really connected with me, is that you might have to welcome your new self, right? Once you go through that path, it's not over once you stop drinking, right? There's so much more to learn about yourself. And maybe, as you're suggesting, you awaken and you're no longer numb to this reality of your body, of your relationships, of your experiences. And now you have to face them anew, right? And I think that can be a challenging and scary thing for people. I know it was for me. And getting to that point that what you're kind of in this place of your new self, it's a wonderful place, but it's a scary place, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think I make the joke in the book that I did all this work and all I got was the unmitigated force of shame, which is my funny way of saying like, oh, I'm not numb anymore, which has
Yeah.
some difficulty in it that you
Yeah.
don't get to be numb to that. But what I'm able to do now that I'm not numb to that is process those feelings in really healthy ways and move through them and not be held by them the way I was held by them before. The other thing that comes to mind as far as just, general non-religious ways to sort of care for yourself is reconnecting with joy in whatever ways that might be accessible to you. I think a lot of people I work with, and this was certainly me as well, when I was at the height of my drinking, a lot of my social life, a lot of the things I did for fun were just drinking, right? Like drinking at the football game, drinking here, drinking there. And then to get sober was like, wait a second, what do I do? Like you get home from work at like 5 p.m. and you're like, cool. So I go to bed around 11, which means I only have about 6 hours to fill my life with something different. And so I think being able to start to lean into those hobbies, try things, you might try something and say, oh, I hated that. Well, great. We've learned that is not something that we're going to keep doing, but we've learned more about our hobbies and things that we want to use to just channel our joy, because the gift is that you really get to feel that joy again. Yes, you're going to have to deal with your emotions, but the gift is you get that joy.
Yeah, I see that completely. I mean, joy is such an important part, and being able to kind of reclaim things that we are doing that maybe we were spending too much time drinking or spending, these moments where we could be deeper involved with experiences that we love. I think sometimes people talk about alcohol as narrowing our experience and becoming more focused on alcohol. So I really appreciate that point. And I just want to thank you for coming today. An absolutely fantastic discussion. And I'd love to hear, where can people hear more about you or learn more about you?
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. What an incredible, incredible crew. I try to keep things pretty simple. Everything is my full name. So Erin Jean Warde on Instagram, on Twitter. My website is erinjeanwarde.com. I will say that I just launched a new community in my Substack. And so erinjeanwarde.substack.com. We're going to have live calls. We're going to have fun stuff. It is not explicitly about sobriety. So if you're not explicitly looking for a sober community, but want to have a lot of fun and also have some other sober people in the crew in the community, we would love to have you. So join us in Chaos Land. And if you have questions or thoughts, I love it when people reach out. So don't be a stranger to me. Send me an email, DM me. I would love to hear from you and connect with people.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I follow her, so you should follow her too, and go out and buy this book, Sober Spirituality. Whoops, let's put it in the shot. Sober Spirituality by Reverend Erin Jean Warde. Thank you all for joining us today. And please, as always, we would love for you to comment, send messages. Tell us what you think and feel about our episodes. If there's topics you want to hear or topics you feel that we haven't covered, I'm happy to look at that and consider it. And otherwise, thanks again for joining us. And here's to mindful drinking.